Maria Jaspers. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. Thank you very much indeed for an opportunity to ask you a couple of questions about cartel enforcement. And today is the 101st episode, and obviously we cannot omit such important area of competition law, pivotal area of competition law related to some significant part of Article 101. And it's hard to find a person who knows better the mechanics of things, who is in the pilot cabin, and who is also very clear and informative in her answer. So thank you very much for the opportunity. So my first question is rather structural nature. If you could tell us about the Cartel Directorate and its structure, composition, and the main functions.
Well, thank you, Oles, including for giving me the opportunity to indeed explain how and why we fight cartels here at the European Commission. And I'm happy to start with explaining who the cartel fighters are. We have indeed a dedicated Cartel Directorate, but some of the work is also carried out in the respective sectorial antitrust units. But in this dedicated Cartel Directorate, we have on paper 4 units, but we work in a pool structure. That means that everybody do the same type of task, and we assign cases and projects within that pool. That reassures that we can maximize the use of our resources and that we can form the teams depending on their knowledge, of their experience, of their availability, but also of their language skills, because all our cartel cases are multi-party cases, meaning up to more than a dozen different companies in the same case, but many of them are also multi-language cases. And that's why we need to make sure that we have a good pool of colleagues to choose from. And within this pool, we also have certain experts pool that focus on different issues. We have, for instance, an inspection expert pool. That's the one that centralizes the know-how of the dawn raids that we do at business premises, but also in private homes. They're the one that trains the inspectors that goes on these inspections. They refine our practicalities and our search strategies. And they work very closely with our in-house forensic IT team to give support to all of DigiComp's inspections. Then you have certain colleagues that are responsible for engaging with whistleblowers and informants, meaning also that they vet the type of tips that we get from informants and whistleblowers. And you have certain colleagues that, for instance, deal with the early discussions with leniency applicants. But everybody are also assigned to cases that they have to drive forward in the system. So this is a great team with many different tasks and certainly very high ambitions.
And if I can continue with this quite caricaturized metaphor was 101. If I can ask you a 101 question on 101, please remind to us the difference. At what point just an anti-competitive agreement becomes a cartel? Where do we draw this line? Line is drawable. What is the scope of your competence?
So indeed, the cartel notion is not necessarily set out in very clear terms in legal documents. We have a notion in the leniency document, we have a notion in the ECN Plus directive, etc., that makes it clear that this is a type of restriction by object where the consequences and the harm are so obvious that we do not need to look into the effects. But if you look at the type of portfolio that we're running now, you will see that there are a lot of different types of conduct that we choose to put into the cartel box. And it has certain consequences. If you look also at private damage actions, if something has been treated as a cartel, then there is a presumption that it led to some harm. It's then for the private damage litigations to quantify the precise harm and whether the one that brought the damage actually was harmed by the infringement. But classifying something as a cartel has certain consequences.
And can you please continue with this portfolio and maybe highlight to us the main cases, major cases or most interesting cases which are currently under your scrutiny?
No, thank you. And I think it is extremely important to understand that cartels comes indeed in different shapes and forms, both in terms of what the cartel is collude on, but also how they do it. I think we're far from the more traditional type of smoke-filled rooms where competitors got together to decide to increase prices. And nowadays, it's also a lot easier to reach a collusive outcome without ever needing to have direct and secret conversations with one another. You can use physical intermediate middlemen, or you can use automized tool for that one. So we want to capture the whole range of different types of cartel scenarios in different sectors. And that's why we have built up a pipeline with very varied types of cases. And that is deliberate because we want to send deterrent messages to many different business actors, and we want to have an interesting pool where we can guide through our enforcement. So for obvious reasons, we do not normally disclose a lot about our ongoing investigation, but if you look at a bit what is in the public domain based on recent investigations or ongoing one, you see that we capture many different sectors and industries, ranging from basic industries to pharma, to the defense sector, to food, to data center constructions. And we also have many different types of cartels. We certainly have a fair amount of classical price-fixing market sharing arrangements, but we also have buyer cartels, we have collusion on product quality, we have no-poach and labor market investigations, and different forms of information exchanges, including information exchanges through public communication channels. So it certainly is a mix of different types of scenarios, and that's precisely what we want.
Let me ask you, not you as a top-tier expert, but your gut feeling. Do you think we capture a significant amount of all cartels, which are obviously taking place secretly, and whether the focus of thematic focus or maybe the type of cartels brings more or reveals more cartels in this sector or in this type of cartel, and thus the more the better, that we need more expertise, more resources, or we are pretty much in this happy medium where it's rather about quality rather than quantity?
Yes. No, I mean, it's impossible to say how many cartels remains undetected and unpunished out there. But precisely because we have the resources that we have, we need to make sure that we employ them in the most sensible way. And that is precisely why, to be relevant as an enforcer, we want to have this range of different types of cartels, because with every cartel, we do not only punish the cartelists that were involved in that cartel, hopefully we also send deterrent messages to others that may do something similar. It can hopefully trigger compliance efforts, and it can hopefully trigger reporting to the authorities. And luckily for us, we are a multi-jurisdictional agency, so we usually look at cartels that have a wider scope. But we work very closely with our sister agencies in the European Competition Network, which means that the cartels that we, for one reason or the other, do not think merit our attention, those will be picked up by the National Competition Authority to ensure that there is no under-enforcement in terms of cartels in the EU.
Maria Jaspers as mythbuster. So I have three myths, true or false. The first one, the algorithmic collusion is a nice fancy thing which is very easy to present to students to attract their attention and imagination, but the reality is much more trivial than our sci-fi thinking nudges us to see.
No, I think the use of AI-powered tools and algorithms is certainly a reality that is spread out over different sectors. I think when you hear competition enforcers speak about algorithmic collusion, we do not necessarily focus on the type of scenarios where robots collude with one another without any human intervention. I think the cases that we have in mind are similar to what you have seen notably on the civil side in the US. These are when companies sign up to a platform, use a revenue management system or a price optimization system that gathers and processes an enormous amount of data, almost in real time, and then recommends or automatically implements certain strategic decisions. And that is very much reality. And it raises issues for the reason that I briefly mentioned before. It allows you to reach a collusive outcome without direct exchanges with your competitors. So the Commission has explained the basic principles of how we would assess algorithmic collusion scenarios, both in the information exchange chapter of our horizontal guidelines that were revised recently, but also in an OECD paper that is published. And this is certainly an issue that we follow very carefully, looking both at the input side, so the data that the users contribute to and with in this process, but also the process as such and the output of that process.
Thank you. Myth number 2, bid rigging is rather autonomous type of cartels, and it is autonomous to the extent that if you start scrutinizing all this suspicious tendering arrangements, you start losing your competition expertise and developing your kind of purely prosecutorial expertise and public kind of law protection expertise. That there are so many issues which are illegal but rather distantly relevant to competition law. True or false?
Well, I don't think that there is a surprise that preventing and fighting bid rigging is a top priority for many competition enforcers, including us. There has been an unprecedented amount of public money that has been poured into our economies. And I think it is extremely important to ensure that that public money is not hijacked by cartelists. So also for us, that is part of our diversified enforcement portfolio, that we are also looking into bid rigging cases. But they do not take up that large part of our portfolio as is the case for certain other competition authorities. And the reason for that one is quite simple, because many of the tenders are are local or national in scope. And that means according to the workload allocation within the European competition network, those would rather be prosecuted and investigated by national competition authorities. We would focus on those that have a more European-wide scope or involve a lot of EU funds. So where we are primarily active in the bid rigging area is rather through training and through advocacy to prevent and detect possible bid rigging scenarios. And we have one ongoing project now, which is quite interesting, which is where we are building a joint bid rigging detection tool together with our sister agencies in the European competition network. So we have pulled together both data scientists, but also competition experts to jointly agree and identify on the red flags for possible bid rigging, and then embed that into a code so that we have a system that can be rolled out and used by all competition authority within that network. And I think that is an excellent example of how we can work together also in the area of bid rigging.
Thank you. Myth number 3, there is direct correlation between the public awareness and the public use of follow-on private actions and the successfulness of leniency and the amount of leniency applications, that many companies just think twice before whistleblowing, knowing what would be the implications on the private side.
Well, to start with the basic, I mean, leniency, which is our system where a company that's been involved in a cartel can self-report that to us in exchange for a 0 or a reduced fine. That has been the golden tools for decades in order to detect secret cartels and bring them to an end. And indeed, a few years ago, we started seeing a sharp decline in the number of applications that we received. And that was a trend that we shared with many other agencies throughout the world that also had mature leniency programs. Luckily, we have managed to turn that declining trend around. Since 4 years ago, we now have a steady increase in the number of applications. And I think there are different factors that play a role when a company decides the pros and cons of coming forward and reporting a cartel to us. And the enforcement landscape has certainly changed during the last 10 years, also because there are more agencies that have leniency program and prosecutes cartels. But I think the big, not the only, but the big game changer in Europe is indeed private damage actions. That the cartelists nowadays know that every case that we bring to an end, there will be follow-on actions before national courts. At the same time, we're still in the early days of the wave of new litigation, which means that they know that we'll have to pay something, but they don't know how much they will have to pay. They don't know when they will need to pay it, and they don't know to whom they will need to pay. And I think that that is an uncertainty concerning what the final price tag will be that had, at least in the past, potentially contributed to reluctance to come forward and cooperate with us under the leniency. But I think what is far more important is that nobody would cooperate unless they think they are better off doing that. And here is where what I think is the main reason why we have managed to turn the leniency curve around is because we have shown that we can generate cases outside the leniency regime, so through our ex officio activities. And companies now know that if they hesitate to come forward and only do that after we have launched an investigation based on intelligence, then they will likely not be able to obtain full immunity. And that is the deliberate position from our side to avoid any let's wait and see if they catch us anyway type of strategy from the parties. So we have been a little bit nervous about the future of our leniency programs, but those days are luckily behind us now, and leniency is certainly alive and kicking again.
If I can pause here, just for clarification, it's conventional wisdom that public and private enforcement go hand in hand, and they are being driven by the same objective, and ultimately they are complementary and mutually supportive. Is it always the case, or you can somehow overshoot the mark with going after those who failed to keep the secrecy and essentially discouraging or strengthening the resilience or awareness of those who are undetected?
No, I think my starting point is precisely what you said. I mean, it's clear that from a public enforcer's perspective, these are complementary tools, and ultimately they serve the same overall goal of reaching optimal deterrence levels. So leniency by facilitating the chances for us to detect cartels and prove them. And of course, for private damages, the main goal is to compensate the victims for the harm that they have suffered. But ultimately, that also adds on to the financial penalties that they will have to pay, and that also feeds into the whole deterrence issue. What is clear in Europe so far is that the vast majority, if not all, private damage actions are follow-on damage actions. So we first take a decision, and then that is used to launch damage actions before national courts. That is different from certain other jurisdictions where you have a lot more standalone private actions before national courts that we have not yet seen. I think what is important for us is that we can continue to develop and drive our investigations forward with the speed and the attention that requires, including at an early stage of an investigation. And sometimes it is not helpful, what we unfortunately observe more and more, that the day after we have issued a press release informing the public that we are doing a dawn raid in Europe, then you have damage actions launched in the US, despite the fact that nothing would at that moment in time suggest that there is any nexus whatsoever to the US market. And of course, this leads to a necessary trade-off for the companies that we are investigating who wants to cooperate in our investigation, but at the same time need to set aside time and resources for these extremely early stage damage actions in the US. And that's an element that I'm personally find frustrating from time to time.
Interesting. Europe was in the different crisis, and there were undertakings find more and more excuses to engage in different types of anti-competitive agreements in a systematic way. How do we treat in the European Union different types of crisis cartels? Does it give them sufficient leeway and excuse?
Well, to start a little bit at the basic, and I think it's always useful to repeat that one, that of course competition enforcement, including cartel enforcement, does not take place in a vacuum. Our cases always support and contributes to other EU policy goals. Just to give a concrete, fairly recent example, 2 years ago, we imposed very heavy sanctions on a number of car manufacturers that had agreed not to compete on the best cleaning performance of their cars. So they had basically agreed that they would not clean better than they were required to do under European regulation, despite the fact that they knew the customer cared about the cleaning performance. And that was normally therefore a factor that they should compete on. And I think this is a good example to illustrate, for instance, how our case practice ties into the green transition. And this is not new, and this is not the only case to illustrate that one. But coming back to your specific question on crisis cartels, I don't think that you will be surprised to hear an old cartel enforcer such as myself saying that that cartels is never the solution to an identified problem. Crisis cartels is something that sometimes pops up as a short-term solution to help a company in distress. We were confronted with this one in the early days of the COVID pandemic, and we concluded, based on past concrete experience going back all the way to the Great Depression in the US, that this type of arrangement would very likely delay rather than stimulate recovery. So I personally certainly do not think that that is the way to go, but it is also important for us that we as competition enforcers, we also have a job to steer and guide business that are going through a difficult market transition at this moment in time. There is a lot that companies can and should do collectively and together without breaching competition rules. And the last thing that we want is, of course, that they abstain from taking the actions that we as a society need them to take at this moment in time, including jointly, because they would wrongly assume that they may end up in difficulties with the competition enforcers. So that is why we have recently, for instance, updated our vertical and horizontal guidelines, and we have signaled that we have an open door policy where we are willing to discuss and even take positions on individual cooperation agreement if there is a hesitation in terms of the degree of flexibility that is inherent under Article 101 when we assess such arrangement in its context. So companies should definitely make use of the tools that we have offered, and we will on our side continue this dual track of sanctioning the infringements that are clearly illegal, and then helping and guiding companies to stay on the right side of the law.
And if you project this formula or apply this formula to specific sector digital markets, where we hear more and more often that the omnipotent gatekeepers, whatever you do, they know how to circumvent, and there is nobody in the pipeline, only micro and nano competitors, startups, or incomparable size. If they start collaborating and cooperating, even maybe boycotting or introducing different techniques which definitely smell anti-competitively, but which are understandable from this perspective, if we take this perspective seriously, do you think it's likely that they will catch the attention of the enforcer first, or they would be somewhere behind in your priority list?
Well, as I said, I think if there is uncertainty from their side on whether different forms of cooperation would be legal or illegal under competition law, then our door is open to discuss that. And I think the type of situation that you have just laid out, and the same, for instance, with cooperation on R&D, cooperation on sustainability, arrangement, etc. These are precisely the type of cases where we would be willing to guide and help to ensure that we can tap in and join the different activities, know-how, and experience in order to drive our economy forward.
And I also have a question. We know that many areas of competition law we've been in the mainstream of kind of more globalized Bretton Woods perception, where law and economics was a common denominators, universal denominator, universal currency, vocabulary, where all were moving in this kind of direction of consumer welfare. Now the things are very different. Jurisdictions are much more compartmentalized, much more inward-oriented, and cartel enforcement appears to be one of pretty much few remaining fields where the international collaboration does have this genuine, sincere ambition and potential. What's the state of affair in the collaboration between DG Comp and other non-EU jurisdictions?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Oles, that this is cartel enforcement is a high priority for all agencies across the globe, and it is an area where we all recognize that international cooperation has clear benefits for all of us. We are, as I said, a multi-jurisdictional enforcer, so it's in our genes that we cooperate with other enforcers, and that includes the very unique cooperation that we have within the European competition network, so with the national competition authorities of the other EU member states, because we apply the same substantive rules, and we have the opportunity to share and use evidence that have been collected by other agencies. But we also work very closely with non-EU authorities, and that of course includes our immediate neighbors, so the UK CMA and the Swiss WICO, where we have a lot of, it's publicly known that we have parallel investigations, either because an immunity applicant filed applications with all of us because it was a European-wide cartel, or because we have decided to act on the same intelligence and to do that in a parallel and coordinated fashion. We also cooperate very well and very intensely with overseas agencies, including, for instance, the DOJ in the US. We have, for decades, gathered a lot of experience in the leniency area, where we have also done simultaneous dawn raids in different corners of the world. And we are now building on that experience also when it comes to our ex officio activities, so when we act on intelligence, meaning that we share experience in the tools, the methodologies, the databases that we use in our ex officio investigations. And sometimes when that is doable and when it's beneficial to all of us, we even share leads and tips so that we can decide to take joint actions. And I think it's important to stress that this is not just something that enforcers dream about or enforcers like to talk about in the public, but it is something that we concretely do. And it is now publicly known, for instance, that a cartel investigation that we have in the consumer fragrance sector, that is an ex officio investigation. So it was not triggered by leniency, and it led to parallel actions in the UK, in the US, in Switzerland, and in the EU. So I think it is a concrete example of how we now cooperate also on ex officio matters. And I would expect that we will see more of that in the future.
Let me ask you, Maria, also about your ex officio investigations. There are many, and they're very powerful and impactful.
No, and thank you for that question, because I think indeed during the 4 years that I have been the head of the Cartels Directorate here, this has been for me the most interesting development and something that I have followed very closely and feel very passionate about. So just to be clear, with ex officio, we basically mean all the investigations that are generated based on intelligence outside the leniency regime. And we want to have a mixture of leniency and ex officio cases because that gives us a broader pool of cases that we can pursue. We're not dependent on what the company chooses to self-report. But we also want to have a mixture of different types of ex officio tools and different types of channels that we get our intelligence through. So I broadly say that there are two categories, two boxes here. The first one I call expanding our eyes and ears on the ground box, and that includes different activities where we encourage stakeholders to be on the lookout for suspicious behavior and report that to us. We have, for instance, our well-known anonymous whistleblower tool, where both individuals and companies can report information and suspicions to us on a fully anonymous basis, so without disclosing and revealing their identity if they, for instance, fear retaliation. We also encourage companies to monitor what is happening upstream and downstream of the market where they are active, and to also engage with us if they have certain suspicions in that respect. We train and we work very closely with non-competition enforcers that may stumble upon something suspicious in their line of duties. And of course, as I briefly mentioned, we also cooperate very closely with other competition enforcers. So that's the first box. And then you have the second box, which is when all the activities that we do to proactively monitor and screen certain markets and certain players in order to detect suspicious pattern, or in order to detect communication and language that should not take place either in the public sphere. And all of these channels that I have just summarized here have already generated intelligence that have led to ongoing investigations. And that I think is extremely important and something that we certainly welcome. So today, roughly 50% of our investigations in the early stage are now ex officio cases. And as I said, that allows us to capture the type of cartels that we think make sense for us to bring forward and advance today, to provide that clarity and guide and steer also through our enforcement.
And let me ask you maybe one of the last questions. If you look at other jurisdictions who are those parts of antitrust enforcers who do pretty much the same part of competition policy, do they do things differently, or do you observe often quantitative or mainly quantitative differences, or there are also different approaches, different kind of philosophies, regulatory techniques and skills and background? So can we say that that you keep learning and keep being surprised by visiting another agency in another jurisdiction, or it's pretty much the same but rather slightly tiny nuances, refinements?
No, I think the beauty of working so closely and so openly with agencies throughout the world is precisely that we learn from each other. Setting aside, as I said, this unique cooperation within the ECN, we of course have different legal frameworks and we have different legal traditions, and we may have different priorities in terms of what type of cases we want to pursue, but we have a lot in common. And we certainly have in-depth discussions, for instance, as I mentioned, on ex officio, to see what have we learned through the institutional setup, through the techniques, through the tools that we have employed, what is happening elsewhere, what lessons can we draw from that, so that we encourage each other, we tease each other a little bit, we inspire each other, and jointly we come out of that process with a more open-minded set that we can employ in our respective cases and policies.
Let me finish with the conventional wisdom that DG Comp and your directorate in particular are dream job for so many young talented graduates who are really keen to join the team. They know that they will be competing fiercely against equally suitable candidates. Maybe you can share some recommendations which you cannot practice within a month or two, but you can focus on maturing within a year or years, so that they can, once the day starts, they will be better prepared and better suitable for the job.
Well, to start with, I have been in DG competition for more than 20 years. So I certainly started when I was very young. That is clear, and I can understand why some regard this as a dream job, because I really believe that it is, and especially fighting cartels. That is my favorite task, partly because I'm a lawyer, and it's more legal and procedural than other parts of DG Comp's activities, and also for this sense of justice, that cartels are clearly bad, they're wrong, and I feel quite passionate about the fact that I don't want them to outsmart us. So we need to have the skills, we need to have the ambitions, we need to have the tools to detect and fight cartels. And that's why we also need to have enthusiastic and smart people joining our great team of cartel fighters. So I would certainly encourage both students and those that are at an early stage of their career to pursue this path. And that means not only deepening their knowledge a bit about competition law, including on procedures, also trying to get some experience, for instance, from law firms, and then try to have either a temporary position with us as a trainee, which means that you get an insight a little bit into what we do and how we do it, but also hopefully be able to pass one of our concours, which is the entry test to become a civil servant in the European Union. One thing that I think is very important is that in the past, the typical people that joined DG Comp were indeed lawyers or economists in certain parts. In the Cartel Directorate today, we recruit far more varied profile, including we have recruited colleagues that have worked in the past in Europol with other types of similar types of collusions and crimes as we are investigating here. We have hired a lot of other people with special skills, including economists, that helps us also to develop our understanding of markets and our abilities to actively screen different sectors, etc. So we are not as narrow-minded in terms of the ideal candidate as we may have been in the past. To the contrary, we see that this collecting the wisdom and knowledge and experience from a wider group is the way forward.
Maria Jaspers, thank you very much indeed for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Ole.